A lot of times I'll ask combat vets, when they're going into a combat situation, I'll ask them, what were you thinking? And they'll say nothing. You just kind of go into, the training takes over. And
it does. That's one of the great things, is that we would constantly train on things. And so it just became normal for us to do things, even though we'd never been involved in an active shooter. When it came time to kick in, I didn't have to think about things. When I pulled to the back, what I did was I grabbed my ballistic helmet and threw it on. I took a deep breath and I said, God, you're in charge of this. And I jumped out of the truck, and my boss said, you take the top of the building and I'll take the bottom of the building, and our guns were drawn.
How many other, you said there were some police there, but they were in a different spot.
Correct. They were at the front of the building.
Yeah.
From what I recollect, there was a lieutenant from San Bernardino PD who was first on scene. And there were 3 officers that showed up. And then there was a 5th one that I saw on the side, but he ended up going to the front of the building. So there was 5 officers when we showed up.
5 officers total.
Right.
Yeah. And all of the shooting had stopped by that point?
Yeah, there was no active shooting at the time. We went in there to say, hey, this is an active shooter and we're going to stop, whatever the threat is. But when we showed up, it was silent.
No, but you didn't know that. When you went into the building, no. Did you think the shooter was still in there?
We didn't even make it inside the building. As soon as we were in the parking lot, we had our guns drawn. We looked and we saw that there were a few casualties laying on the ground. And as we scanned the parking lot, we saw maybe 20 people hiding in different spots behind cars and electronic transponders and trees and things like that. And because it was so quiet, we changed from an active shooter to a rescue mission.
Just right on the spot.
Yeah. And I mean, they still could have been there, but the rule is if there's no threat actually going on, then there would be no place for them. I mean, we could scan 3 different buildings and we could be there all day, but there was no place for us to go to an active threat.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that every 15 seconds, probably another police officer is showing up, right?
Oh,
the response ends up being massive.
Yeah, it was. It was so massive by the time I actually made it back to the street that I would say there was probably 500 officers there.
Yeah,
and that would be lowballing it.
Yeah. So, you mentioned seeing casualties, so we'll come back to that. But so how did all this get organized? In those first few minutes, I'm imagining someone took charge, and how did that work out? So that because you started playing a role that we'll talk about. How did it work out where folks just sort of figure, okay, I'm going to go in the building, you do this, I do this. How did that work itself out?
At first, there was a lot of chaos, and we're using different channels on the radio. Probation was using their own channel, the PD was using their own channel, and the sheriff was using their own channel. And eventually what needs to happen is there needs to be an agency that takes over, and then everybody goes to that channel. But we didn't know who was in charge at the time.
Wow.
And so what my boss did, he saw one shooting victim. He had them jump in his car, and another officer showed up, and they just took off to the hospital. On my truck, I lowered the bed, and we put in 14 to 15 people inside the truck, and there were 6 of them that had gunshot wounds. And as I switched my radio over to the sheriff's, I heard that they were trying to set up a triage center north of us, but then they changed it to south. And so I had to wait for a place for me to go, so I didn't have anywhere to go. I went to a side parking lot. I flipped my truck around and put the engine block between me and the building because we still didn't know what kind of threat was there.
Yeah.
Within a couple minutes, 2 of the SWAT tanks came in. Once they came in, the triage center was set up and I was able to go out. The whole street was lined with ambulance. And so I parked the truck, got all the victims out. Each one of them had a different EMT paramedics that they were dealing with.
Yeah.
At that point, I was ready to go back in, and I got stopped by the assistant chief for San Bernardino PD. And he said, "Hey, I want you to handle the media." And there were two deceased bodies that were about 20 feet from me that I was also in charge of taking care of.
What do you mean what do you mean
To keep people away, like the media, that it wouldn't, that they weren't going to go in there and start, taking pictures and stuff like that of, uncovering stuff. They were covered with a tarp. And so basically I had two media people, and I basically told them, I said, "Hey, I know you guys have a job to do, but here's your guidelines. You need to stay within this area. We still don't know if it's safe or not. As long as you can do that, you're free to do, whatever you guys need to do to get your job done. But help me out so I can help you stay in this area." And they were really, everybody just pulled together. There was no individualism on this. And it was from everybody, the police, the sheriff, probation. There were Border Patrol that showed up, Homeland Security, the CHP, just everybody. And it was basically, if there was like the assistant chief who told me what to do, it wasn't like, "No, you're not the boss of me," or something like that. It just, we knew how to just fall into place to get things done.
You're flying through San Bernardino. You get in there really fast. You've got an active shooter situation going on, so you know that this is big. I mean, this is bigger than what you've got to deal with, normally, and probably you realize it's bigger than anything you've had to deal with up to this point in your career. But, was there something that happened that really, when you're on the scene, that drove it home that, I mean, this is, I don't know, I mean, this is just a huge thing, or are you just in kind of?
I was kind of numb and just going through the motions.
Yeah.
One of the guys that I grew up through the ranks with, at one point we were taking a break in between the bomb squad and then the actual takeover of the SWAT shooting, and he came over to me and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm fine. How are you?" And that night, when I looked back at it, I realized that the guy was covered in blood from his head down to his waist. And so in my thought at the time was like, "Yeah, I'm fine. What's up?" And then it's more of a, he needed reassurance that everything was okay. And so I ended up calling him, and he was like, "Yeah, I know it was a crazy day, and just stuff happened." But it took a day for it to really kick in.
Yeah, so that's what I'm wondering about, because I mean, it's not a combat situation, but it's like a combat situation, and I've talked with a lot of combat vets, and is it kind of that, because you said you got there and you saw two casualties, you didn't say whether they were wounded or whether they were
deceased.
They were, and
yeah,
at that time they weren't covered with a tarp.
No.
So now is it the same two that you're now keeping the media away from?
I had no idea who was actually under the tarp, because they brought him over there and they were already covered up.
So you've got that, and then you're putting wounded in the truck, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it sounds like, I mean, is what you're saying that as all this is going on, you almost kind of go into, I mean, just kind of, I don't know what the right way to put it. I mean, you're almost in kind of robot mode, just whatever needs to get done, get it done. And, kind of the human thing, the emotional thing, that'll come later, but I'm not dealing with that right now. Is that kind of what's going on?
Yeah. Myself, my boss, and then a couple of my co-workers that were on my team, we had the chance to debrief together after everything was over. And all of us were that way. There was no emotion about it. It was go in and do what you were trained for. And there was no thought to even take the time to think about it. until that next day. Our team thinks in a way of not, hey, look, we did a good thing. We think in the way of what could we have done to make it better? Because if this happens again, what are we going to do differently? Yeah. And it took about a week for me to realize the whole magnitude of it, because I had to go away for some training out of state. So I wasn't able to debrief with everything. And so when I came back, I was able to talk to people who had roles of, they were guarding the deceased, waiting for the coroner to announce that they were actually dead so they could notify the families. And those weren't things that you think of normally. You know, the people that escorted people on the bus to a safety place as, you know, people were screaming and crying and things like that. You know, you just think about what your job was, and you're basically oblivious to what everybody else did. And so I was able to piece a lot of it together by talking to different people and seeing the different roles. And it just made me more sympathetic for each of the officers' roles that they had.
Two of the photos that I have that you're in, I'm looking at a white truck, and looks like you've got some, I mean, I'm just seeing right now, just looking at these photos, I'm just seeing one. But you said you had a bunch of people in the back of that truck.
Yeah, there were 14 to 15 people in the truck. I had 3 to 4 that were in the front with me. The rest of them were in the bed. And I believe it was 6 people who sustained gunshot wounds. And so once we pulled up there, we basically said, hey, if you can walk, help the person that can't. And so basically they helped each other get out of the truck and get over to an EMT. And yeah. So, I mean,
did they go to your truck just because you were one of the first to arrive and your truck was close, or?
I was the only vehicle that was there when we started loading up people.
Okay.
Because my boss, he'd put one person in his car and then whoever the driver was left. And so I was the only vehicle that they could get into.